Anant Harper. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Today we focus on two different sets of international relations that could be under stress. First, India's relationship with America in the light of reports carried first by the Financial Times and then by the Washington Post alleging that Indian government agents might have been attempting to try and kill an American citizen on American soil. And then Israel's relationship with the United States and how that's been affected by Netanyahu's behavior over the 50 days of the Israel-Hamas war. Joining me live from Washington is the diplomatic editor of The Economist, Anton La Guardia. Mr. La Guardia is the author of Holy Land, Unholy War, Israelis and Palestinians, as well as War Without End, Israelis, Palestinians, and the Struggle for a Promised Land. Anton La Guardia, let me start by asking you about two stories that have created an enormous stir in India. I'm referring to reports carried by the Financial Times and by the Washington Post that the United States thwarted or nipped in the bud an attempt by India to kill on US soil an American Sikh citizen called Gurpant Singh Pannu. This story is very similar, as you know, to allegations made 2 months ago by Justin Trudeau in Canada. What is the cumulative impact of both these stories on the way the Biden administration views India, and I suppose specifically the Modi government? Are serious questions being asked in Washington about a relationship that is considered to be quite close?
Yes, I think it is worrying that you've now had two such incidents, and any country that has Sikh minorities living on its territory will be worrying about what's happening in their countries. I think the United States has a dilemma. Successive presidents have courted India as part of a great geopolitical play to counterbalance China and Russia. At the same time, democracies are not going to accept that their citizens or residents on their territory are murdered on their soil by external powers, and especially not by a country that's supposed to be a friend and a fellow democracy. So you have America, you've seen America take a cautious line over the killing in Canada of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, but the Americans have let it be known that there's intelligence to support Prime Minister Trudeau's claim. But they're not joining, for example, in the expulsion of diplomats that you've seen between Canada and India. So on this one, the administration spoke out more sternly, I would say, saying it expects India to investigate and to hold those responsible accountable. But it also seemed to give India a way out, repeating the view that Indians say that this is not the government's policy. So leaving open the possibility, I suppose, of some kind of rogue operation that the government of Narendra Modi could distance itself from.
Now, 24 hours before the Financial Times first broke the story, President Biden skipped the G20 virtual summit that happened on Wednesday. And now he is also failing, or at least very reluctant to confirm, whether he will accept India's invitation to be chief guest on our Republic Day, which is the 26th of January. Do you think both of those the absence from the G20 virtual summit and the delay in confirming whether he'd accept the invitation to be chief guest on Republic Day could be linked to concerns to do with these allegations?
That will be one reading of it, but I think it actually depends on a lot on what India does in the coming days. The White House has said that India will have more to say on this subject soon. So I think we have to wait and see what the government says and comes up with.
Can I put it like this? Republic Day in India is now literally just 2 months away, 2 months and 2 days. If President Biden in the end does not accept, and the Indian government considers it a huge honor to invite someone as chief guest on Republic Day, would that be a sign of a certain amount of concern or displeasure?
Yes, I think so. If it didn't go, there would be seen as a sign of tension, given the importance of India that we all know the US attaches to the relationship. That said, the president has a lot of demands on his time, not least the crisis in Gaza, as you know.
One last question about this issue before I switch to Israel and the USA. Beyond the White House, what impact will these allegations, and specifically the one about trying to kill an American citizen on American soil, have on Congress? And could it in some way critically affect the defense deals for drones and jet engines, which Congress is considering and which will not pass if Congress doesn't clear them? Could there be an adverse impact there?
Again, it depends on how things play out. There have been some concerns expressed in Congress about human rights in India, but it has generally been favorable to deepening the relationship with the country. And in any case, Congress is distracted by lots of other things, not least the negotiations over the budget and the looming shutdown, and the fact that a supplemental request for aid to Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan has not yet passed. I think America has also shown, in the case of Saudi Arabia, if you remember, whose crown prince President Biden called a pariah, that he will swallow quite a bit of irritation for reasons of state. But it is also true to say that as India moves worryingly down the road to more overt nationalism, intolerance, and authoritarianism, it will be harder to make the case for stronger relations with India in the West.
In other words, India can't expect the pass that Crown Prince Mohammed got.
I don't think there'll be fist bumping in the same way, but they've been more fond of bear hugs. But I think they will tread very carefully in relations with India. But I think India also needs to tread carefully in its relations with the West.
Let's come at this point, Mr. La Guardia, to US-Israel relations during the last 50 days of the Israel-Hamas war. First, the BBC has said the Americans have been heavily involved in brokering the hostage deal, and if everything goes to plan, the hostages should first be released in about an hour and a half's time. Netanyahu has personally given credit to Biden, and Reuters has carried extensive details of Biden's conversations with the Emir of Qatar. So how critical in your eyes was America in ensuring this deal happened?
Well, I think everything that is happening currently in Gaza has a large dose of American involvement. Everything from the rushing of military aid to Israel, the deployment of military assets such as aircraft carriers to the regions around the Middle East, and indeed the negotiation of this particular deal, and in the future, the ending of the cessation of hostilities. So the Americans have a particular interest in the hostage deal because they have their own citizens in the mix, so dual Israeli-American nationals in the mix. By the way, there are lots of other nationalities that have also been taken hostage by Hamas. So the Americans want to get their people out. As you see, they've made a lot of efforts around the world to get Americans out. But I think they also hope that this negotiation over a limited hostage deal and a limited pause in the fighting and an increase in humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip begins to open the negotiation towards a future cessation of hostilities.
The paradox is that whilst America has stood solidly by Israel, and Biden in particular has personally stood side by side with Netanyahu, there is an increasing impression that Israel is defying the US administration. For example, Lionel Barber, the former editor of the Financial Times, told me 2 days ago that Netanyahu has thumbed his nose at Biden. And I noticed that New York Magazine says that Israel has angered the Biden administration by the way in which Netanyahu refuses to accept the advice being given by Biden or by Blinken. Is that your impression as well, too?
There's a mixture of love and irritation in that relationship. Joe Biden is, in his bones, a Zionist supporter. He says so himself. But he intensely dislikes Netanyahu, going back to the days of tensions when Biden was vice president in the Obama administration, and relations were very tense. He will not have forgotten the way Netanyahu rallied Congress against the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration signed. Moreover, Biden, coming into office, said he would try to return to a two-state solution, which Netanyahu has done his utmost throughout his career to torpedo. So there is a lot of tension in that relationship. And nevertheless, the attack of October the 7th by Hamas, swarming across the border of the Gaza Strip, wantonly murdering Israelis and taking them captive, struck a deep chord with America in general and with Biden personally. There have been, and I think just to say, in Biden's embrace of Israel, I think there was also an attempt that wrapping him in love would also serve to constrain the more extreme impulses of Netanyahu's administration in the hope of restraining Israel's retribution. Whether that's been successful or not is open to severe question given the number of people that have been killed. And people in the administration speak quite openly about their dismay at the number of people that have died, particularly on the Palestinian side.
Let's explore the way you beautifully put it. Has Biden's embrace succeeded in constraining the extreme impulses that Netanyahu often gives into? First, when Biden visited Israel, he publicly said Israel must not be consumed with rage and repeat the mistakes that America itself made after 9/11. But that seems to be exactly what Netanyahu has done. 14,800 people have been killed according to Hamas so far, over 36,000 injured according to Al Jazeera, and vast swathes of Gaza have been reduced to rubble. Then 2 weeks ago, on the 10th, Blinken publicly said far too many Palestinians have been killed, and at that time the death toll was just over 10,000. It's now crossed 14,800. So would you accept that America, in terms of this advice, has been ignored? And if you do agree, how's that gone down in Washington?
Well, it has. Look, the United States, after 9/11, reacted with a great sense of moral outrage at what had happened. And it went into Afghanistan and then Iraq. And I think Biden had in mind the fact that not enough thinking was done about the day after, how to run these places afterwards, particularly Iraq. So I think that was the advice he was trying to convey to Netanyahu, that you have to be careful in the way you conduct your operations because you quickly lose international legitimacy for your action, the sympathy, the great wave of sympathy that Israel had after its own citizens were murdered. And secondly, that you need a plan for the day after. And I think on both counts, Netanyahu is showing no sign that he has a plan for what happens, for who runs the Gaza Strip after Hamas is defeated, even assuming such a thing is possible, because he set a very high bar saying he wants the destruction of Hamas, which is more than just a terrorist movement, as ISIS was. It is also a political movement, a social movement, a charitable movement, and an idea. So it is a difficult passage, but Biden has, in the end, pinned his colors to Netanyahu's mast and can only hope that the more sensible people in his cabinet and in the army and people like Benny Gantz, whom he's brought in from the opposition into the kind of war cabinet, will act as a restraint. But every time an Israeli right-winger or Likud member talks about transferring Palestinians out, about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons, of describing Palestinians as the biblical Amalek, people who must be or forever the enemies of Jews, is hurting Biden at home, particularly within his Democratic Party.
Let's take forward the point you made in that answer. Just a few days ago, Biden wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, and he made it quite clear that his administration supports a two-state solution with Gaza and the West Bank united under the Palestine Authority. In addition, in that piece, Biden said, and I'm quoting him, there must be no reoccupation, no siege or blockade of Gaza. But it's no secret that Netanyahu for 16 years has staunchly opposed a two-state solution. He's dismissive of the Palestine Authority, and he's gone on record just in a couple of days ago to say that Israel will indefinitely maintain security control over Gaza. Now, how much does this grate with the White House that their president lays down in black and white what he expects, and without his support, Netanyahu would be in trouble, and yet the response from Netanyahu is to either ignore or defy, or simply say the opposite?
Again, it makes the relationship difficult, and as the war goes on, it becomes more difficult. And whereas the Israelis have been willing to make some concessions to the Americans, accepting a humanitarian pause, as we've seen now, allowing belatedly and grudgingly the entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza, on the question of where this ends up, they are far apart. So two things are possible. Either the Americans are mouthing the pieties of the need for a two-state solution, or they expect that Netanyahu will not survive very long. If not the war, then shortly thereafter, in the repercussions, the political repercussions that there will be over who was responsible for what is, after all, the greatest single-day loss of Jewish lives in Israel since the creation of the state. But if Netanyahu survives, then I think you will see increasingly open tension between the two sides. Now, that's not new in relations between Israel and the United States. They are not, Israel is not a vassal of the United States. There's always a degree of separation. And as you remember, Bill Clinton tried very hard to get the sides to make peace and did not succeed. So they don't always do what America wants them to do, although it has great influence because of the great importance of the United States to Israel.
The interesting thing, Mr. La Guardia, it's not just over Gaza and Gaza's future that Biden and Netanyahu seem to differ quite markedly. They've also got serious differences about what's happening in the West Bank. In that Washington Post article, Biden said that he had been emphatic with Israel's leaders that extremist violence against Palestinians in the West Bank must stop, and those committing violence must be held accountable. And according to Al Jazeera, over 227 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October the 7th. But in response, and publicly in a press conference, Netanyahu said, I told President Biden that the accusations against the settlement movement are baseless. I mean, here is an instance. After the American president goes in black and white, the Israeli prime minister stands up publicly at a press conference to contradict him.
Well, Netanyahu has created the most far right-wing government in Israeli history, with people in his coalition who are, who want to annex the West Bank outright, if not push out the Palestinian population. So this is the great source of tension, because Netanyahu, if he's to have any hope of surviving the war and its aftermath, knows that he needs the hard right parties to support him. So he is not going to distance himself from settlers. He's not going to distance himself from the far right. He kept them in the government, even if it meant keeping the main opposition party outside the war cabinet because he relies on them. And in any case, I think Netanyahu genuinely believes that the settlements are important and that in the end there is no solution to the Israeli-Palestinian question except to keep fighting. That is, I think, his core belief.
Let me raise one more problem that could occur between Netanyahu and Biden. It's one that looms on the horizon. It hasn't quite materialized itself so far, but almost certainly it will, possibly in 4 days' time. And that's because when this 4-day truce ends, Netanyahu has repeatedly made it clear that the airstrikes on Gaza will resume. The war will be continued with the same ferocity, I presume, as we've seen over the last 50 days. And if that happens, the Palestinian death toll will rise, and it might rise very sharply. And my question is this: how many more Palestinian deaths can Biden accept before America's critical relations with Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar start getting pretty adversely affected?
It's impossible to tell what the breaking point is, Karan. I think one big worry for the Biden administration and for sensible Israelis is how far is whether there will be the opening of new fronts. You mentioned the trouble in the West Bank, which could be a second front. More important, there could be trouble in Lebanon with Hezbollah, which is another front that worries the Americans because that could in turn suck them in to fighting. Iranian pro-Iranian militias have been attacking American forces in Iraq and Syria with increasing frequency, drawing direct American responses. So there's another source of worry. And then there is the possibility of the unraveling of peaceful relations that have developed between Israel and its Arab neighbors, such as Jordan and Egypt, and the hope that Saudi Arabia would normalize relations with Israel. Now, I think those diplomatic processes are at a standstill for now and risk going into reverse. Jordan and Israel have, for example, withdrawn ambassadors from each other's capitals. It should be said that a lot of these Arab governments, apart from the Qataris, are deeply skeptical of the Muslim Brotherhood and of Hamas, who are a Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So on the one hand, they hope Israel will indeed defeat Hamas because the movement presents a danger to them. On the other hand, they also know they have to respond to the feeling of their citizens who are dismayed by the extensive bloodshed that Israel has inflicted on Hamas. And if fighting resumes, remember, most of it is limited to northern Gaza, and the population has been moved deliberately by Israel to southern Gaza, but Hamas is present in southern Gaza. And if Israel is determined to root it out completely, then what happens next? Do the Israelis move to southern Gaza and squeeze the Palestinians to ever smaller pockets of population or expose them to even greater danger? Nobody will say. So this is, again, potentially a second wave of bloodshed, of even greater bloodshed and political turmoil and outrage around the region.
There is a moral question that the global South is asking. Let me put it to you and ask whether anyone in America is raising that question as well. And the question is this: increasingly, it seems that Israel is prepared to fulfill its target of obliterating Hamas, no matter what the cost in Palestinian civil lives. That is a moral question that worries the global South. Does it find resonance in America, whether in the White House, whether in Congress, or whether in the media?
Well, it finds resonance in the left of the Democratic Party, certainly, where the question of Palestine has become enmeshed with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. So there's kind of mutual sympathy there. It finds discomfort in the White House when people like us ask, well, do you see these actions as war crimes? And American spokesmen say, well, it's not for us to judge, but we wish fewer Palestinians were being killed. But if on the right, on the Republican right, You hear voices saying the administration should not be placing any restraints on Israel in responding to terrorism. So you have a spectrum of opinion in America, as you do in most countries. But I think it is fair to say that countries in Europe are more worried about the harm being done to Palestinians than the broad American public in general.
Now, the problem for President Biden is that his strains and tension in the relationship with Netanyahu are beginning to find a domestic reflection. Opinion polls in America show that public opinion, and particularly that of young Americans, is steadily shifting away from Israel and tilting increasingly towards the Palestinians. More importantly for the president, an NBC poll shows that 56% of all voters disapprove of his handling of the Israel-Hamas war, while 70% of those between the ages of 18 and 34 disapprove. He's got less than 12 months before voting takes place for the next election, and he's still determined to stand. How much pressure is this putting on him?
It will be very worrying to those planning his re-election and to him and to the Democratic Party. It matters because American elections are very narrow affairs and are determined on a few tens or hundreds of thousands of votes in a handful of swing states. So particularly where there are Muslim minorities or where the left is strong, that could be enough to swing an election in a key state, particularly if the youth vote starts to drift away from the president. The question he will be posing, no doubt, is, well, do you think I'm better than the alternative, which is the Republicans, who in general are even more ardently pro-Israeli? So where does someone who just is dismayed by what's happening to Palestinians go? The worry for the Democrats is that they will just stay at home and not vote and not turn out, and therefore that will be a weakness for the Democrats in the turnout game. Having said that, Biden is losing approval generally, and on foreign policy now. And there is a sense that when things in the world go wrong, the president is somehow to blame. His response has been, as we've said earlier, to try and hug Israel close in the hope of influencing its direction and limiting the damage. But it's not a happy picture for him. He is just as worried, of course, by the idea of being seen to be weak on Israel and being seen to be weak on terrorism, knowing that centrists and the right will pounce on him if he appears to waver.
But could this actually tip the election against Biden? Could he lose because of the way he's perceived to have mishandled the Israel-Hamas war?
Americans generally don't vote on foreign policy. They vote on domestic policy, particularly the economy, and on social issues, for example, on abortion. So this will be a distant, but I think it will color the image of the president if he's seen to mishandle the question of Palestine. And that maybe if he's seen to be too tolerant of Israeli killing of Palestinians in the war, but it may also be if the war continues and the mess goes on. So I think he needs it to end fairly soon so that he can return to dealing with domestic issues. And remember that he's got problems elsewhere in the world, not least Ukraine.
Two more questions before I end. Haaretz, the well-known Israeli paper, has reported that Israeli military intelligence had specifically warned Netanyahu about the possibility of a Hamas attack, but Netanyahu chose to ignore this dire professional assessment. Separately, the BBC has reported just 36 hours ago that 3 separate diplomatic sources from other countries close to the talks have said that a hostage deal was all but agreed before Israel sent troops and tanks into Gaza. The first suggests Netanyahu's irresponsibility. The second hints at a determination to kill Palestinians and flatten Gaza no matter what. What impact will this have on American public opinion?
I think there will be a lot of blame to spread for who was responsible for missing Hamas's preparations for the attack. You've seen in recent days increasing reports that junior soldiers, the spotters who watch the video footage of Gaza, have been feeling increasingly queasy and sent a report up to superiors that they were seeing unusual patterns of activity that seemed to suggest a multi location attack to get across the border, rehearsals to kidnap Israelis and attack neighboring communities. So I think there will be lots of military people who will be held to blame. There will be lots of intelligence people who will be held to blame. And of course, the prime minister will be held to blame. The difference between Netanyahu and other senior figures is that the others have said they accept that they missed the intelligence and missed the warnings, and Netanyahu hasn't, and has indeed appeared to try and shift blame to others. So there will be a reckoning to come, but I don't think it's clear who really was to blame for missing it. On the hostage deal, there were a small number of hostages released before Israel was moving into Gaza, and I suspect that Hamas was probably dangling more hostage releases to try and forestall or to complicate a land operation. But I don't think that you cross the border into Israel, kill hundreds, if not thousands of Israelis and not expect a land response. So I think that Hamas in the end wanted to draw Israel into Gaza, to bog them down, to heap international opprobrium onto them, and to show that they are fighting and to wreck Israel's diplomatic negotiations with the likes of Saudi Arabia, for example. So I think to come to your question, finally, American opinion is broadly sympathetic to the Israelis, but is increasingly queasy about the cost that Israel is exacting on Palestinians.
My last question, could the opinion polls, which are veering away from Israel and coming closer and closer to being supportive of the Palestinian position, could these polls have an impact on how US relations with Israel and I suppose the wider Middle East develop in the years ahead? Could these polls push future administrations to be more wary, if that's the right word, of Israel, and more understanding and supportive of the Palestinians and therefore closer to the Arab position?
This question has been asked for a long time as evidence has emerged of Democrats and Republicans moving apart on the question of Israel and of Palestine, especially among the young. But with Biden's election, we haven't really seen that. His talk so far of wanting to further a two-state solution has really been a kind of political preference rather than actual policy that he has pursued. And if anything, Biden has wanted to try and build a peace process, not from the inside out, with the Palestinians and radiating outwards, but to pursue the outside in option, which is doing a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia in the hope that that would ultimately influence Palestinian views of a settlement. Now, there is a problem, which is that Palestinian Authority is weak, and therefore there's a perception that there wasn't really a good partner with which to promote a peace deal. And in the years of quiet, there's been a far greater acceptance of Israel in places like Europe, for example. So the sort of Western support for Israel ebbs and flows with the circumstances and with the kind of scale of fighting on the ground, and the scale of Palestinian suffering and perceived suffering. So I think this will be a bad wave. Whether this war is so brutal that it breaks those relationships, I am not sure. I am more inclined to think that, when the fighting dies away, and assuming the war hasn't spread, and assuming there is a reckoning in Israel, that there will, people will revert back to the mean, to the positions they held previously, wishing, supportive of Israel, but wishing they were nicer and more forthcoming to the Palestinians and hoping for Palestinian statehood. It's sad because Palestinians don't have a state; they're dispossessed. But nobody in the West seems to have the will to make Palestinian statehood happen. And Israelis will always point to what happened October 7th and say, if a Palestinian state looks like Gaza, no thanks, we don't want that.
Mr. La Guardia, thank you very much for the time you have kept for me. Take care.
Very good to speak to you, Karan.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.